Hey, everybody. It is Sick Talks number 90. I'm here with James Denman, who is one of my, let's call it LinkedIn crushes, if you will, like somebody who does uses that platform to great effect, both for my, information and edification, and also just, I think, generally to like the benefit of the community generally. He's a executive brand marketer and a fractional CMO, and like I said, a writer of things that I pay a lot of attention to, including his newsletter, The Society of the Spectacle. So, but James and I don't know each other, so this is also kind of a cool, like, meet cute on the internet type thing. So, James, how are you?
I'm very good, and I'm a little bit blown away by that very very kind introduction.
Well,
What,
it's not throwing fits, but I try.
yeah, no, I mean I think it's the LinkedIn's what can you say? It's a funny platform, filled with absolute nonsense at times.
Yep.
But I think the value that people can get from it is really really I wouldn't say I don't want to say profound, but like it's really credible. It's just I think you
Yeah.
have to sift through it and you have to find it. And I think one of the things that's also I think being very tangible about it is how focusing on niches, finding those people that really I think have a genuine expertise and a passion and an insight into categories. I think helps immensely, and I think that's sort of like how I think that translates quite nicely then when you think into other verticals. I think of Andrea with Snack Shots as an example. I think of
Mm.
Emily with Feed Me. There's such these sort of like clarities of thought that go through everything, and I think it's it's just about trying to impart interesting ideas or at least sort of thoughts into the world that maybe haven't been considered. And then
Yeah, I mean,
hopefully nothing about Jaguar, even though I did write about it.
oh man, oh man, it's funny. I talked to my other podcast, Culture Club show. I talked to Jeff extensively about Jaguar, and it felt, on the other hand, very late, and on the other hand, very evergreen, because these sorts of things are going to be, they'll exist forever. All right, well,
Exactly.
avoiding that hot potato for a second, you are, I sort of, I think of you as being um, part of and conversant in the worlds of fashion and luxury in particular, of brand, of strategy, but also, of the current conversation, I guess. And that's the sort of the Jaguar thing. How did you end up here? Like, what brought you to that, like, locus of output?
I, I, I mean, it started in a way from um, going way, way back to when I was at art college. So, when you're at somewhere like St. Martin's, apart from the fact you shout and scream, they study sculpture at St. Martin's College in the Pulp song, like you get a sense of you're just immersed in it, right? You're immersed in
Yeah.
a world where people are talking about really interesting sort of ideas. They're working in different disciplines. You've got friends in
Yeah.
textiles, you've got friends in jewelry, you've got friends in sort of like design, product design, which is what I did. And I think you that's a continuation almost. It's a really great jumping off point, I think, for the rest of your career, because at that point it felt quite natural in many ways for me to sort of like I guess exist or sort of work in this sort of space, and that really coalesced when I got to Spring, and I was at Spring
Okay.
Studios. And Spring Studios obviously at the time 2013 was very sort of like I think focused in that sort of like space. And as I said, it sort of coalesced a lot of my expertise, and I think it built my experience from that, working with brands like
Hmm.
Diesel or Mulberry or whoever else it
Sure.
was, some of the brands like Estee Lauder. And I think that really helped create that focus and create that focal point that then allowed me to sort of like continue to burrow into that. And it's always been something,
Right.
therefore, I think I've been, not just interested in, but I worked alongside. And most recently, I was the SVP of global brand strategy at Esprit. So working with
Right.
Anna Angelic and an amazing crew over there to really help sort of like bring that brand back to life.
Yeah. So okay. So just to go back a second, for those who don't know Spring, so Spring Studios is one of the sort of un. It's a great example, along with Milk Studios being another one, but it's like this kind of unsung model of content creation and event venue, but also agency capacity that springs up, no pun intended, off the back of that, studio and venue capability. And it's sort of like the theory of making a whole greater than the sum of its parts. I would imagine being there would have been crucial to your sort of, let's call it marketing or brand building education, because you start to think about like not what is the thing that we make for a channel, but rather what are all of the things that we could make for all of the channels, and how can we find somebody to pay for that to happen, or alternately, how can we engage someone that we're not already paying in a way that benefits that? Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah,
I think I
it
had
is,
something similar
and
advice.
yeah, and I think it had, look, as ever with these things, it had its growing pains.
Of course.
And I think the way that it was always sort of like centered was you very much had, Spring was seen as this almost like hub. You could come there and you could sort of like do the content creation sort of piece of it. You could work with the production team. You could work with the editorial teams. You could very much sort of like, at its apex and at its peak, you could work through those different channels in a very cohesive sort of like manner. And I think, and it almost was starting to become a sort of like self-fulfilling prophecy. If you had a brand that came in and felt like they really embraced what the model was and how the model was going to sort of like work, you were always going to get, very, very strong sort of like media, strategic sort of like communications planning sort of like thinking, but you're also tying that to like a very, very high touch. If you look at, some of the alumni out of that, the team at just did a Closer, and the team at Closer just did the 57th Street Vuitton building. And I think, you know what I mean? And there's an example that's, I wrote about that recently, and I think people really, that was a really funny one because people didn't think it was real. I mean, straight up.
I didn't think it was real the first time I saw it. I didn't think it was real.
And I've seen it sort of like build over a couple of different weeks as sort of like pieces go up and up and up. And I'm just like, that's a scale of ambition. That's a scale of sort of like scope and sort of like sheer nerve. I mean, that's really what it is. I mean, I think, brands of that scale obviously can work at that level. But what's interesting for me about what that did is it's now put the marker at the rest of the brands. It's not to say Prada has to then go and do this further down on Fifth Avenue or anyone like that, but it does say that if you want to create this, the type of marketing content that you can create in this environment, if you have the ambition and you have the scale and you have the aptitude and commitment to craft that really reinforces, you're in a much stronger position over the long term.
Well, okay, so it's interesting that you should say that, because so for those who listen to the show regularly, you know that this is a companion to my Thursday newsletter, SIC Weekly, which aggregates typically 100 or so sources, things that I have just been paying attention to and that I think are indicative of where the culture's at, let's call it. What I typically do is I send the list of links in progress to my guests, and my guests pick out 4 or 5, and we use that as kind of a spine for discussion. You, James, are the first person who has ever, thank you, sent me links in advance and said, "Here's what I want to talk about." So I love that because I get new sources of inspiration. But I also I thought that was really cool because I love the fact that it's like you're turning up to this with stuff you want to talk about particularly. The reason I bring that up is because you sent me 3 links, I think, to brand films that have come out recently. One from Yves Saint Laurent, one from Brunello Cucinelli, and one from Gucci. And you had, I think, different reasons for talking about all of them. But what struck me about them was twofold, right? One, these are beautiful films that are high production value, clearly like very sophisticated in terms of their art direction, trying to satisfy lots of different like objectives from a marketing outcomes perspective. But 2 of them are very good and feel evergreen, and one of them feels very disjointed and totally messy.
Wait, let me guess. Let me guess which ones. Because I have a feeling I know where you're going to go.
Jump in.
No. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, but the other thing that we were talking about this at Breakfast Club today, you got to come join us sometime. Everybody has to come join us sometime. We do it every Wednesday. But we were talking about how the Brunello and the Gucci and the YSL, I think, had under 100,000 views on YouTube, each of them. And what I thought was really interesting about that was that they are these massive marketing expenditures. And clearly they're not just meant to create value on YouTube, but they are in the days of yore, they would have been the kind of thing that the brands would have felt impelled to boost and promote and try to get to 1 million views because that's the sort of measure of success or whatever. I want your take not only on the films, but also on, like, are we seeing a shift in terms of how these brands are coming to realize what their actual space in the marketplace is and how they create evergreen value, exactly to your point earlier? Or are we still stuck in sort of transactional mode, which is what I suspect drove the disjointed example?
I think there's a few things there in place. I think the one that is also important to like mention, and really the one that sort of like kicked off the mini thought, for want of a better word, was Chanel. So, Chanel has done it consistently over the last, look, Chanel has always invested, right, heavily in film. They have the money, they have the clout to do that. I think we all remember the Chanel No. 5 ads that have that sort of like, they turn up maybe once every half a decade, and it's like, they almost feel like they reflect their cultural moment a little bit. If you remember the early 2000s ones, it's sort of like Nicole Kidman, Baz Luhrmann, sort of like, I guess, Moulin Rouge cosplay, for want of a better word. And then you've got Giselle, or, sort of like the surf one. They've done one most recently with Jake Elordi and Margot Robbie with Luca Guadagnino. Sorry, butchered that
I can't
name.
say his name either.
Which sort of like, it's fine. Yes, I mean, not to be blasé about it, it's perfectly adequate. I think there's an interesting sensibility, but the one that they did for their Métier d'Art show in Hangzhou is really interesting, and it picked up a lot of traction because I think, you've obviously got, I don't like to get into the whole sort of like who's creative director gossip sort of like thing. There's other people that can sort of do that who are 50 times better at doing that, frankly. But I think what, obviously Chanel's had a little bit of a real sort of like roller coaster with Virginie like leaving, the brand feeling that it's undergoing its own sort of dynamics in terms of, wear, ready to wear, sort of wear, haute couture, and the sort of like the fashion piece of it sits in the context of, the wider business in terms of fragrance and beauty. And I think what the Tilda Swinton film demonstrated was a return almost to this sort of very elegant, like very connected storyline. The idea that it was coming from Gabrielle Chanel's own home, where she'd seen, she had these sort of like these Chinese sort of like I've forgotten the name of the, but like, this artwork effectively that then translates so neatly to where the show was, to how it came together. And it was calm, it felt measured, it felt like the brand was floating above itself, which I think inevitably a brand like Chanel should operate as. I think they did some work with PG Lang earlier in the year, which is obviously Kendrick's agency.
Interesting.
Now, PG Lang has a very specific aesthetic that they translate from, when they work with their brands. They did some work with Calvin a couple of years ago, I think, to even, when you watch, Kendrick's music videos. So, there's a sort of, you felt a narrative sort of shift, and it was picked up upon by a few people, I think, that, sort of keyed into this and are recognizing this. Where I think the Saint Laurent example went, and I think what's really interesting is obviously Anthony Vaccarello and Saint Laurent is doing a lot of work within the context of films, right? So that it exists it's both marketing, but sort of like almost just a brand building exercise in and of itself. When you're working with someone like Nadia Lee Cohen, who I think we all recognize as someone who's really, really talented and can go upstream into the Saint Laurent world, but equally can sort of play in the, like, where Skims were. She did a most recent thing with a partnership with Dolce & Gabbana and Skims. And I think that dynamic is, again, very esoteric. It doesn't need to have sort of like lots of sort of like points of light in a way that say we are going to be connecting to we're going to be slicing and dicing so it sits in this channel or this channel or this channel.
Yeah.
I think when it comes to the Brunello one, I think what's interesting about that is obviously Brunello has done very well this year in the context of the luxury downturn. Everyone is sort of like low key or not, or maybe major key freaking out. And what Brunello has done consistently, and again, others are sort of, very good at, I think, articulating this, is it's world building. It's a pure
Yeah.
world building device. And when you go into that holiday, it doesn't feel like it's Grand Budapest Hotel cosplaying. It feels something utterly unique and distinctive to that sort of brand. And it
Yeah.
feels like, when you are getting into then how that then translates into its marketing, how it's showing up in all of those different channels, it feels like a very, you're not going to feel that disconnect in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah. I want to stop you there for a second. I do. I want to stop you there for a second because I want to ask. I want to make an observation and I want to ask a question about it. So the Brunello spot that James is referring to is let's call it fall holiday, winter, seasonal spot. The idea is that it's a ski chalet or a alpine hotel or something like that, where a bunch of guests come together for a holiday party. The thing that I thought was sort of remarkable about it is that it dodged for me the Wes Andersonian tweeness a little bit because it didn't feel like it insisted on every detail being Brunello. The staff of the hotel, I don't think were wearing Brunello. They were dressed in appropriate hotel gear. And so the guests then felt elevated from them. And you didn't have this sort of weird question like, why is the bellboy wearing Tom Ford type thing? It's like, because that would never happen in real life. And so I thought that those were smart choices. And I wonder whether you think that's like what creates that sort of ineffable difference.
I mean, I think this is this comes back to a larger point about craft in general, right? These little touches matter, and I mean that might sound so ridiculously obvious to say, but I think in these type of environments, in these type of pieces of communication, in this type of marketplace, frankly, it is easy. It would be easy to sort of like in some ways sort of forget or dismiss them and go, oh, that doesn't matter. This is the consistent beats that build these brands, and they give them that sort of like that high touch, that form, that sheen that you sort of like come to recognize. When in the Sun to Run example, one of the characters, and the example I sent you, because I think there's 6 of them, based off Marcel Proust. She walks in the runway piece from the most recent show back in October. So immediately you're connected. If you I guess I don't want to say if you're in the know, but if you've seen that work, that there was a very, I guess, semi-viral photo that went that existed from the show, which was Bella Hadid in that sort of effectively the same. It wasn't the same color, but it was the same sort of like styling look. So therefore you've sort of connecting back the dots between all these different fragments and these elements that start to sort of like that I think come together. But to come back to your point, I think those details really, really matter, and they are equally, sometimes the difference in how something can be sort of like perceived, whether it's you understood every single point of the narrative that you're trying to execute against, or you just sort of went like, okay, we'll skip around it.
Yeah, we'll figure it out. We'll sort it out in post. It's interesting you should say that, because I guess for me, as I'm listening to you talk, I'm thinking about like a Brunello Cucinelli sweater. It is not out of the question to say that it might cost $5,000 or something to that effect, right? Which is another way of saying there are 5,000 reasons to say no to buying it, and if even the slightest thing sets you off and makes you think like this isn't exactly the thing I want or need, or is going to make my life better or whatever it is, then you're just like, forget it. Like these guys are trying too hard is a reason to not patronize the brand and to move your custom elsewhere. And I think that it's funny because that then brings me to the bad example, which was, you guessed it. I mean, well, it's funny. Like you sent that and with a WTF, And so I was expecting it to be like, I don't know what I was expecting it to be, but I wasn't expecting it to be what it was, which is, and here's how I would describe it: competent, but nonsensical, and therefore meaningless, and therefore valueless. Like it was just like, it truly was what the fuck, but it's not a what the fuck in a, like, I can't believe I just saw that in a like, what is this doing? Like, who's driving the boat?
Um, who's driving the boat's an interesting question that I probably shouldn't touch on. But look, the Gucci has been a bit of a bête noire this year for me, in truth, because look, you don't want to end up in a sort of like that sort of armchair strategist sort of thing where you're and I think coming back to I said about the Jaguar thing, I think there was a lot of that. There was a lot of engagement farming around that, and a lot of people sort of deciding to sort of like have their point of view in any way propagated by the algorithms at that point. The Gucci thing is interesting because I think, and I have talked about this on the Substack. I've talked about this in other places, and I think Burberry is an interesting corollary here.
Mm.
When Gucci came out with, like, when Sabato De Sarno came out with his first sort of like vision, point of view, etc., everything felt very cohesive, and it was this idea of Ancora.
Yeah.
And Ancora is sort of, it's always this idea of like, again, it's a sort of like there's a lot of sort of, they never truly defined it in the sense of one definitive sort of like statement, but it sort of revolved around this idea of almost like a reset and renewal, and this idea of going again. And what I found interesting about that rollout was, as it first came out, it almost was a bit like going back to what the Vuitton example we talked about there. It was like this sort of like, Ancora red, this deep blood sort of like burgundy, beautiful sort of like color. And it was just the name and Gucci, right? And it was a huge out of home rollout. I think from a media perspective and a media rollout perspective, I was really impressed. I mean, because I saw it was almost like that 0.5, I guess, or if we're thinking comms planning, right? It's that tease phase, right? It's setting up that sort of story. It's setting up that sort of like narrative. And it then sort of just seemed to never be followed up. And there wasn't this idea of like, the marketing at this point, the point that we're trying to make Vancora is that in many ways, it gives us an air cover to create and rethink some of the things that you may well have seen from Gucci in the past with Alessandro Michele, et cetera, right? Yeah. It was a true sense of that palette cleanse. Now, you could debate the merits of that from a sort of, from more of a product perspective, but it felt like, that sort of, I called it like, I refused to refer to it as a monolith, right? It felt like Kubrickian in that sense of, it was just this thing that appeared, and that repetition was like, okay, I'm excited about what the potential of this is. Mm-hmm. And you have to follow out that potential. And I think clearly the numbers that Kering, Gucci makes up a significant amount of the profit margin for the Kering group. So you've got that where, Saint Laurent doesn't in the same way, right? So it's a slightly smaller brand. It can play a little bit more at that point, but you've then got real commercial pressures sort of like driving that. I think, you've then, so it felt like the marketing sort of like lost its nerve a little bit, in truth.
Oh yeah.
And it sort of like, it didn't follow through with this idea, and something that I have talked about in my own work of like, the great brands are built around this idea of clarity, consistency, and bravery. Now, that might not be the most revelatory thing on the planet, but what it does talk about is if you are a luxury brand or a fashion brand, the idea of being incredibly clear about your brand positioning, your brand, your strategy at large, the consumer that you're going after, that clarity and that agreement within the context of the business is huge, right? Yeah. Then consistency is not about 4 campaigns a year. It's about that sort of entire product pyramid, but that consistency driving down and making sure you've got that rhythm. And, that allows and opens the door for bravery. And bravery then can come in those smaller bets, and can come in bigger innovations, whatever else it might be, long-term horizon, short-term sort of wins, however that manifests. What I sort of was struck by was it sort of lost its nerve, as I said, and the work started to sort of like ping off in all different directions. You had Yannick Sinner with, sort of, Gucci's a feeling. Okay, well, what's the feeling? Don't know. I guess you'll have to go on the website to find out. You know what I mean? There's an element of just this sort of things start to spike off and go in different directions. And I think the problem you've got now is numbers are soft, right? The product's actually coming into store. So in terms of, Desano's work is actually now, is actually being, from what I've heard and what I've gathered from different readings and going in there myself, it's well received. People like it. Sure, it's a little bit more commercially orientated than maybe some of the other stuff, but it works. But it also then the creative work just feels like it's completely, again, I don't want to sound like I'm just trashing someone's work, because there's a lot of effort that's gone in that, but it feels unfocused. And so you've got, you've now got the I Feel Love remix from Blondie, which was at the cruise show. And so you've now got Nan Golden shooting a campaign over here. And then you've got then you've got Kendall Jenner in here. Then you've got a snowmobile in there. Then you've got the Knowles that no one remember. It's like the fan. It's just bizarre, and it's just sort of like crazy.
It felt to me like it was decision by merchant. It was essentially like, what have we sold in this season? Let's make sure that each one of those items is featured prominently, because we have to sell the things, not because we have to create a feeling or we have to, create long-term brand loyalty. And the funny thing about that is that it's very it's thinking that you don't see in successful luxury brands over time, because the whole point is that they afford to think like, how do I create a lifetime of actual value and meaning for people, as opposed to how do I flog this t-shirt.
And they did some brilliant, the thing is that I think was in some ways frustrating as well, was some of the misses have obscured some really interesting pieces they've done. They did a whole series around the Gucci loafers, for example, right? And that was very much a sort of like a true reset of like, okay, this is where it comes from. This is why it's this. This is the sort of like the narrative and the history and the heritage behind it. And you're like, okay, I mean, it's an evergreen product. It's never going to go off the shelves. But in the context of this idea of Ancora, seeing something from a new perspective, seeing something renewed, I thought that was an interesting connection point. I also really loved what they were doing at Salone del Mobile.
Oh, okay.
So some of the work they did, again,
Milanese
exactly, Milanese design fair, yeah. And that's about, sure, taking, there are very strong connection points in the context of, great Italian design from 60s, 70s, 80s, all the way into sort of, how that sort of, some of that aesthetic sort of like language connected up. They made a whole series of suite of products. It was using those color palettes again in a very distinctive manner. And at that point, you're like, okay, that feels like this idea of Ancora is you can transpose it to different worlds. You can transpose it to different categories. Now, you might not necessarily buy that right now, and you're not going to be sort of like in the marketplace for a sort of Ancora red sort of like sofa in the next 2-3 years. But you know what? Once that sort of repetition sort of like comes alive, it becomes a bit of a recall, and it becomes this idea that, I do actually want to be associated with that. I do want to have that as a sort of, as a hook, as it were. So, they have a new team. I think that's coming online, and some of those people are starting in January. And I think, there's a lot there. It's just simply a case of clarifying, simplifying, and then consistently executing. Because I think this sort of like, what feels like throwing money at the problem, when you're putting Solange and Tina Knowles, you're putting Kendall Jenner, Julia Garner, I can't even think, I think Dakota Johnson, there's an army of the sort of like house people that they've sort of, or house sort of, sort of like friends of the house that they put in there. But you need it to feel like it's coming from somewhere consistent and clear, because in this sort of like, in a marketplace where, I think the the challenges are there in terms of sort of like in terms of revenue anyway, right? You're over indexed in China. China's obviously, I think as we well know, going through some real issues from an economic standpoint right now. And I think, coming back to one of the points I did want to make, if you contrast that with what Burberry's done, where Burberry has sat down and had taken a long, hard look at itself and gone, what do we want to keep? What do we want to sort of evolve? And what do we sort of, want to sort of like discard, for want of a better word? That is an absolute masterclass. That it's always Burberry weather immediately gives you a sense of the core products that they want to lean into, the storyline that they want to sort of connect it back to, the tone and tenor is sort of like lifted up. And it immediately just feels like, okay, I might not be in the market right now for a sort of like a Burberry trench, but I buy the scarf. There's scarf bars now in the store that they've re-merchandised it. So there's a lot of sort of thinking, I think, that can go in that's very quick wins that start to sort of build a bit more of a positive narrative.
Right. Interesting. Okay, so let's talk about some of the other stuff you sent me, because there's one thing. I think everything you sent me was interesting, but there was one thing in particular that I felt like a real discovery, and I have to admit, I'd had maybe some wines when I read it, so I was maybe it was more illuminatory than maybe I gave it credit in the moment for being more illuminatory than it actually is. But this was Mo Diggs' post about the divided Gen Z, the divided generation. I don't know anything about Mo Diggs. I had never heard of this Substack, which is called Cross Current, before. But I thought this was a really fascinating piece, and I wondered what it was like. I wondered what your backstory on it and why you thought that was something to talk about.
I mean, I thought, it was interesting to me because I would not count myself in the context of sort of like a sort of cultural foresight or, people like Matt Klein who do this so much better. What I found that was interesting, it's this idea of like there's so much fragmentation, right, in terms of the audiences, in terms of how like Gen Z see themselves, how they perceive themselves, how they shape themselves in different sort of like in different forms and narratives for sort of like the context and the situation they're in. And it really struck me because I remember having a conversation. There's this idea of almost like there was a bit of a mythologizing around like Gen Z of like, certainly I think maybe a couple of years ago, and maybe even around the context of the pandemic, of like they're going to solve everything, it's going to be great, and actually they're just super you know what I mean? It's sort of like they're super complex, they're contradictory, they have these different sort of like, and it just really struck me like how like I think the way and the form that he was sort of like talking about these different sort of like sub sort of like subsets, as it were, right? And the behaviors that sort of like come into that, and how they cross-pollinate at different times, but also sort of like have very, very different and distinctive sort of like codes. So for me, it just felt like a very interesting and dive into that sort of like space, certainly context of post-election. And I think what really sort of like, I think it was a bit of a wake-up call, I think, for a lot of people in terms of how they operated.
Look, I think the piece is really interesting. There's a line just to highlight quickly. He Mo in this piece, and do you know Mo? Are you familiar with this person? Is this something you just
honestly, it was one of those things I came across, and I think Substack is just so good for this. I think it really is a phenomenal platform because it brings these voices that I don't want to sound like I'm not going to see on the mainstream media because that's just weird, but there's such a sort of like, you can bring that voice together. Exactly. You can bring it together in such a clear manner and form. And I think, so no, I'd literally, it just sort of popped up in my feed.
Yeah, new name to me, so I've got no background on him at all, and it's funny because the piece is, in a certain respect, feels like it's written from the position from the standpoint of a Gen Z person, and then it's also says a bunch of stuff that I kind of don't. I'm not sure how a Gen Z person would have access to that insight, but either way, it's the one line that stuck out to me was he says, was a time when a generation gap was between generations, not within a generation. And then, why is Gen Z so hard to pin down in general? when you market to a millennial, epic bacon Gryffindor. A Gen X, you say slacker weed, back off, man, I'm a scientist. But Gen Z has no monoculture, so the next best thing, or the next most effective thing, is to look at some of the subgroups within it, and then figure out how you market to those. What I wonder about is, as a marketer, putting on your marketing hat for a second, to what extent this feels like a fool's errand to think of Gen Z as a population unto itself, the way that I think we learned in the election, thinking of like Latinos as a single group is just like totally stupid and beside the point. So I wonder what you think about that. And then I also wonder if we can't think of Gen Z as monolithic or united in most ways, like how do we think about them? Or is everybody just Gen Pop all at the same time now?
Okay. A lot to unpack there. I think, look, I think, in many ways, what that article is sort of like, in that, or that Substack post, I don't even know what the terminology you'd really put it through. It's sort of, I think it speaks to the idea of, like, dare I say, finding a little bit of that sort of like your niche a little bit, right? And
Sure.
almost then sort of like, being able to sort of like find little points of light that maybe are sort of like connected sort of like through that. I think there's an element of, that there's so much literacy in that sense of the audience, and they understand, and so terminally online about what's happening and where those sort of like niches are. I think that's the way that you can sort of like start to sort of engage in it. I think, but I also think, I think of a brand like someone like Marc Jacobs is a good one, I think, because I think, Marc Jacobs does a really good job of like playing into these things in a very, very sort of like in and out way, right? You see it on their TikTok, you see it on their sort of like,
Sure.
on their TikTok in particular. You look at even like, I think the way they has done a really fantastic job at this. I mean, obviously they just got that Fast Company most innovative brands example, but there was a whole article, and I completely forgotten the name of the guy. He runs their TikTok, and it almost has its own, it's its own language, right? It's its own language that completely fits in the context of the audience it's trying to connect to. Its relationship to, let's say, what Jurgen is shooting is both is sort of there, but it isn't overt, right? It's sort of like it creates that idea of consistency, but consistency through tone and tenor, and then how that transposes to different brand, like the different audiences. So I think it's sort of like that. There are two examples, I think, of how you can, or how brands, certainly in the context of fashion and luxury, have started to really burrow into these sort of like worlds. But equally, those worlds sort of like feel like they morph and they change and they evolve, and the sort of like the codes and the cues in them sort of like shift at such speed as well. You almost need, and I think it would be right to say for most sort of like fashion brands, someone who is not just a sort of social team that's dedicated to this, but the fact there is someone who is just deliberately, actively working on TikTok at Loewe tells you something about, the focal point of the channel for them, but equally sort of like the commitment they've made to that you almost need that sort of like channel specific sort of audiences and people to execute within that to really understand the very sort of like niche nuances that exist, I think within all of the context of those different channels.
Well, it's funny. It's funny you should say that. So I had dinner the other night with a Gen Z agency run by Gen Z people, and the 25-year-old founder was asking me about Vice and where I felt like things at Vice had gone wrong. I realized something that I hadn't clicked for me before, which was that up until around 2018, we made things according to the way, in the audience's voice, but also according to the way that the audience made things or wanted to make things, right? It was in terms of low production value for the most part. It was grab and go. It was extemporaneous. It was documentary. It was immersionist. It was in the moment. In 2018, there was a big strategic pivot because of the rise of Gen Z as the theoretical dominant audience, and we cued into or the decision was made to queue into. I wasn't part of it, but the decision was made to queue into Gen Z by way of their identity. And I think what was proven over the course of time was that identity is not as strong as an indicator of durability and success as behavior, and that because we over-indexed on identity, we ended up trying to be everything to everyone, as opposed to being the best example of a means of creation. And so it sounds to me like the Weve example is like, we're going to be native to TikTok and we're going to create in the best way of TikTok. And the way to do that is by incorporating people who are great on the platform, not by trying to go, every population on TikTok is this, and so we have to make something for all of them.
Yeah.
Right?
I
which is
think
the mistake that Gucci made.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's, I mean, it will be interesting to see what happens if it is ended up getting banned, and how that sort of like how that changes and how that sort of like I wouldn't say evolves, but like what the consequences of that are. But I think it's that idea of like you're building sort of like, I think for you're building for algorithmic sort of like virality rather than simply just sort of like the niche of that sort of like or the idea of there being just a sort of different sort of like cut downs as it were. So I think there's like as I said, I think there's a lot of really interesting sort of like experimentation that can happen on that sort of platform. And I think the idea of that challenge, I think again from a sort of a more fashion luxury sort of like brand perspective, is how do you balance that those points, right? How do you get what you want to stay at that very, very sort of like high level, as it were, but then how does that translate down into some of those, or how much of it translates down into some of those other sort of like more tactical parts that, are maybe where people are in a more frequent sort of like manner.
Yeah. Okay. So what's your over under on if TikTok gets banned?
I think
go back
it's done.
Forth.
I think it's done.
You mean okay? So and then the question becomes: so if the law goes into effect on January 19th, the day before President Trump will be inaugurated, does this turn into a sort of like early pandemic moment where suddenly the earth is healing, people go outside again, they come together in groups, they marvel at human connection, and then Trump just makes it legal again and everybody goes back to
the reason I think it will I say the reason I think it's happened, and I'm in no way any like a sort of like a
we're not inside on this
decision.
Yeah,
we're not reading lawfare here, we're not sort of like inside baseball here. But I think there's a book that I've read, and it's it's by Nicole Perlock, called This Is How They Tell Me How the World Ends. I might have butchered the
I don't know it.
It's the story of cyber warfare. And it's got one of those titles that sort of like, you're like, oh, interesting. And in the context of that book, that's why I believe, like, because it's so sort of like, there's so much sort of like things that are happening under the hood of all of these stuff. Look, we know about this from a platform perspective, right? And that for me is the problem that the government has in this. I mean, it's almost an impossible task to persuade anybody about this when you have, 180 million Americans, I think, on TikTok. I'm on TikTok. I mean, I think most of us are, right?
Yeah.
Is the fact that like that for them to turn around and go, well, it's a national security threat, which it probably is, doesn't wash with people who A, had their livelihood on it, B, sort of like, just enjoy it for whatever it is. They've found amazing things on it. They've gained knowledge off it. They've laughed at it, whatever,
What's a part of their identity in certain respects, right?
Yeah. That's why for me, like when you read that book and you certainly get to the back end of it in terms of the things that other countries and our country, I include the UK and America in that point, can do with this type of stuff. I just, it's just sitting there, and I think that's why it will get banned. But again, I think the argument that it's an impossible impossible losing argument for a government to make around what this is and implicate. So, Trump may well, he may well turn around the next day and sort of just not sort of like I guess proceed with the ban or whatever sort of like form. But I am not equally that sure about that either. I think there's a lot of different things that feel like they're coming into play with that. But as I said, I think from a book, when you read that book, like a lot of the choices that they're making around this actually end up making a ton of sense.
Right. So the book is,
without putting my tinfoil hat on.
Yeah. No, I understand. I'm just looking it up. It's called "This Is How They." Whoops, hold on. This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends: The Cyber Weapons Arms Race, and it's by Nicole Pearl Roth.
So she'd written for the New York Times. I think she was their defense or sort of like their cyber expert for a long time, and it goes all the way back to the Cold War. It's a very interesting sort of history. It gets a little bit sort of lost in itself at times, and a little bit wonky. But as it gets to the end, you really are like, oh, okay, right, like this is a real thing.
All right, I'm adding it to my Amazon list.
Yeah, Steph, I wouldn't say it's a holiday book. It's not something that like but it's definitely sort of like, I think, it's one of those books that have stayed with me for sure.
Yeah, interesting. This has been. Are you a copious reader of books and offline material, or is that like your book for the year type beat?
No. I think it's a little bit of a guilty secret that I'm obviously putting out into the world, but I've actually just got hugely into audiobooks, and I think audiobooks for me have been like, so yes, I've read a lot of books this year. I mean, you could maybe make the assumption, or like I've consumed them. I think I just finished a book that I'd read all the way back when I was at college, actually, England's Dreaming, which is the story of punk from the point of view of sort of Malcolm McLaren, obviously up into. And that was a sort of one of those. It had been a long time since I'd read it, and it was one of those books that just sort of like immediately just like reconnected, like just it's so visceral, it's so beautifully written. It also comes from a point of view, very much, I think, from the role of subculture in that. And look, we talk about subculture, culture, but etc. incessantly. How like the punk audience and how that sort of like how that built both in a very deliberately but also then organically through that idea of sort of like just to discuss with what the system and with the idea of just almost like the inanity of music at that point for that audience. There's something really powerful and compelling about it. And equally, I think I'd always had a soft spot for it because my nom de guerre, the Society of the Spectacle, is obviously Guy Debord's book from the sort of like Situationist. The King Mob, which is my handle for those that care, is the British arm of the Situationists from the late 1960s into the early 1970s. So there's always been this sort of like world that I've always been interested in, that I've connected with, that sort of I think has it was nice to sort of like be back in the like reread it and reconnect with it a little bit.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just looking up at this bookshelf here to see if I have like a book on situationism like within arm's reach.
I mean, I've got a fair few up here, but
it's certainly not far away. So okay, so that's interesting. The other thing that is interesting about that notion is the role of McLaren in it as a both like true believer in the spirit of the moment and also as a master manipulator and sort of like surfer of cultural gestalt. I find him fascinating. So the reason I ask is because I wonder to what extent people who think deeply about these subjects, like yourself, have required reading, so to speak, across many categories, or whether things feel very, or not very, but like more, let's call it adjacent to the work that you do all the time, that kind of thing. You joked about the that book not being holiday reading, I just started Long Island Compromise, the Taffy Brodesser Akner book, and so that'll be my holidays. I'll get through that. But this year has been a very tough year of reading for me. I haven't gotten through nearly as many books as I normally do, and I've felt very frustrated by it. So I wanted to hear how you're charting on your journey.
I mean, I'm just like, I mean, the beauty of I've just ended up just sort of consuming a lot of different but I mean, mine have always sort of like gravitated around, sort of like music or fashion or sort of like or like a film. I mean, the usual sort of like tropes for someone of my age and my sort of like interest points. But I think there's I'm trying to think what else I read this year. I mean, like I think I read a really interesting about the Oscars, which was sort of like I didn't anticipate being very, very interesting, but
like a book about
it was about
Academy Awards.
It was about the Academy Awards, and it was these sort of like and they lent, and it was a New Yorker writer, and I can't remember his name. I'd have to maybe look on my phone to work out what it was, but it was effectively this idea of there were very key moments in the context of the story and the evolution of the Oscars, right? In terms of when there's, certain inflection moments, whether it was, in the late 60s with obviously the sort of Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, sort of like, crew coming on board, or if it was in, the 1940s where there was sort of like this, there was the Hayes Act, and there was a lot of these different sort of like things around sort of like censorship. So, and it takes these sort of moments, builds little sort of like context and worlds around it. The other book that I read, and I actually was just talking to someone who wrote, again, Power of Substack. I'd read a Substack piece by a writer called James Craig, and he'd written about a book called Erotic Vagrancy, which is it's not quite a biography of Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, but it sort of operates a little bit like it. I had no context of Richard Burton or Elizabeth Taylor in the context of film, their sort of cultural heft in the 60s. But this is one of those books that is written like with such a fearsomeness in terms of language, and and again, it also reveals, I think, the value of a great audiobook. Like an audiobook with a really great narrator just takes these things from like here to there,
And it's interesting. Sorry, I just got to stop you for a second, because I just, when you said audiobooks, I was reminded of the last audiobook I tried to listen to, which was Miranda July reading All Fours, which I had read the book and then was like, oh, it's on Spotify. I'll listen to the audiobook as well, just to kind of hear how she does it. And I found it impossible to listen to. I love Miranda July, and I found it impossible to listen to because I was just like, I shouldn't be hearing this in your voice. I need this in another narrator's voice. So anyway, what's your point about the narrator?
No. I think that, but the thing is, no, it's super interesting because I think look, I would argue, I'm not a huge fiction reader in truth. So, I imagine from an author's perspective, that can be a little strange, and you almost need someone who can play, almost create those characters and create that sensibility. What was amazing about the Erotic Vagrancy book was you just realized how much, and this is one of the things I love in general about sort of like music culture, film culture, sort of, like fashion, all of these different ones. It's like there's so much in some ways that's lost, or at least has been forgotten. And not I was intending to talk about Taylor and Burton in here, but what's interesting about their filmographies is there are just some absolutely insane films that they made, both together and apart, that are just completely like just you can watch them on YouTube. I mean, some of them are free. But if I think of things like Secret Ceremony, which is almost like the British Rosemary's Baby, and everyone knows Rosemary's Baby, but
of course,
no one could tell you about Secret Ceremony.
Never heard of it.
Or there's Burton's sort of like, most people know Michael Caine and Get Carter. They might not know Villain, which is a sort of counterpoint to that. It's sort of like very early 1970s London, which is sort of my hometown. So I'm always curious to see what London looked like back then. And and that's a great film that's got like Ian McShane in it. He's obviously in the John Wick films. It's sort of one of the first. He's an East End hard man, but he's like queer. Like there's so many different layers to it. You know, I could go on. There's films that tailor made in the early 70s that very much sort of like fit into the giallo subgenre. You know, so it
Right.
almost feels like a Dario Argento film, like a
Right.
sort
So
of
Italian horror. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So you've got these sort of like weird cross currents, and then there are also like these incredibly famous people who are also frankly arseholes, like truly horrendous people at times. And anyway, I found that to be a very, again, like books that England streaming where they open doors, and I think
Yeah.
that's something that's for me is a consistent theme of how I like to approach, you know, whatever I'm putting on something on
Right.
LinkedIn
Ways
or
of seeing it.
on my on the Substack. I think, you know, that, and I don't want to say it's a lost art because I think it would be, that would sound like sort of awful. It's connection points between things. I think is such a joy,
Yeah.
and it's such a
Yeah.
joy for people to sort of like dig into. And it doesn't mean it has to all be about like going back and whatever and sort of like finding the most obscure thing. It's not like, you know, record collector or anything like that, but there's just sort of like there's you know, you can, and the internet has done such a great job, and YouTube I think especially is amazing
Yeah.
at this, of like those sort of like connections and coming back to something or finding something else, and you know, you're just digging deeper, and there's always something that you can sort of like find, and there's always something I
Right.
think that uh feels like
Well,
it opens another door.
yeah, it's how we access the sublime, right? Is through those
Exactly.
corollaries. All right. Well, James, listen, we are at time, but this has been really fun, and I appreciate
Wonderful. Thank you.
the reading recommendations. I mean, yeah, and like your you know, way of going about this. I know I tell people to do it a certain way, but I wish more people would do it like you too. So it's thank you for that. I
Well, thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Appreciate it.
All right, everybody. This has been SIC Talks number 90 with James Denman. You can find James at the Society of the
See the
Spectacle.
spectacle. Yeah.
On Substack, as well as when I say he is an excellent LinkedIn follow, I mean that with all 10 toes. Go check him out there. And then beyond that, just somebody to keep track of. So James, thanks for being here. We really appreciate it.
See you later.
Bye.